everyone. I would like to start by thanking the European Parliamentary Research Service for organizing this event in cooperation with the EUI Policy Roundtable on the untapped potential of the area of freedom, security and justice, a topic that I've been dedicated to for some time and where today I will present to you and will dedicate my presentation to only a couple of areas within this very broad field of EU's intervention, three main fields: asylum, borders, and migration. And I've been asked to address a couple of issues. First, progress made at EU level, and second, looking at the potentials. What else can we do with what we have? Now, in my presentation, I will start with a brief background, scoping these three policy areas in light of the Lisbon Treaty and the EU Better Regulation Guidelines, one of my favorite documents lately. And, of course, I couldn't but address this topic from the perspective of the European refugee crisis, which has kept us busy for the last 2 years. What effects, what implications can we see in respect of European cooperation in migration, borders and asylum when looking at the so-called crisis, European refugee crisis? So it's been, as Wouter mentioned, 20 years of European cooperation since Amsterdam and the Tampere European Council conclusions, and very few people would have or could have anticipated how much has been done in these policy areas at the EU level. The dynamism characterizing these domains has been really impressive. For domains which traditionally has fallen within the scope of national sovereignty. National governments have been very cautious at times of having any EU in these areas. And despite that, many things have been done during these almost 2 decades. And for the better or for the worse, these policy domains are now at the very top of the EU agenda. I remember 15 years ago that was not the case. And now, because of latest developments, there is a lot of discussion. And I think that this kind of events and the work of European Parliamentary EPRS is helpful at times of bringing evidence and research for informed discussions and policy debates in issues that we all have, our opinions, but that should be well grounded on the best scientific data. Now, if I were to identify a major development in this domain, if someone will ask me, I will certainly pick the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty changed things fundamentally in these policy areas, in the Europeanization of migration policy, asylum and border policies. This Lisbonization has meant effectively more EU, more democratic scrutiny, more judicial control of decisions which are shaped or are taken in Brussels. And just as a footnote, this area of cooperation used to be characterized precisely for a lack of checks and balances. And this is precisely what the Lisbon Treaty brought. This rule of law, democratic rule of law, perspective in European decision-making in areas that are not of everyone's interest, but affect all our liberties and rights. The European Parliament has played a key role. The European Parliament has really driven and called many times for better lawmaking in these fields, and the Lisbon Treaty, I think it was an achievement also from that perspective. The European Parliament became co-legislator in many of these domains, and as I will explain in a minute, this has meant better law in many of these domains and more guarantees in many of these policy areas. Now, the current Commission is very much interested in better regulation, and I think this is a very good thing. Those guidelines and toolbox that I mentioned before, I think provide us with very good basis for doing things better at EU level when legislating in these domains. And when looking at costs and benefits, one of the questions that come to my mind is that, of course, the area of freedom, security, and justice repercutes very profoundly on people's liberties and rights. So, of course, economic costs are very important, costs and benefits, when assessing efficiency, but also the impact on people's rights and trust also is absolutely central. I think it's especially central in these domains. So what has been the progress made? Well, there's been a lot of progress. It's a pity that Claude is not here, because I was going to praise the LIBE committee work in this field. I mean, the workload that LIBE committee has had during the last years is not to be envied. I mean, it's extremely heavy. Of course, this reflects the relevance of the European Parliament as a co-owner of EU policy in this domain and as a co-legislator. So it's, I think, all good news. Very briefly, taking through or starting with the area of asylum, this is an area where the EU has done a lot to build a common European asylum system. There is actually a very solid framework of secondary legislation, that we can spend some time reading. Is very robust. The European refugee crisis has brought to light perhaps one of the key deficits in this common European asylum system. We all know about it, the EU Dublin system. The EU Dublin system, which puts a special emphasis on the first entry rule. If people enter irregularly, that member state must assess the asylum application. And this has been perhaps one of the key controversies behind the European refugee crisis. This is also reaching the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. I mentioned judicial control, and the court is playing a very important role in judicializing this area. And in latest judgments, Advocate General Sharpston mentioned very clearly that the Dublin system simply has not been designed for dealing with situations like the one we experienced in 2015, where you have an impressive number of people entering a humanitarian, very problematic situation in Greece. Simply the system doesn't fit that situation. This, along with the fact also that some member states, and it's not only Greece or Italy, do not have proper asylum procedures yet or reception conditions. Even systematic flaws in the asylum systems make things more complicated. And the EU response here in asylum was the temporary relocation, the so-called quotas, which was all over the press and has been criticized for being ineffective. From the original goal of 160,000 people to be relocated from Greece and Italy, only about 27,000 more or less have been relocated so far. But I think we need to be cautious at times of criticizing this, because it is true that the Commission was put at the forefront of political fire on responding immediately to this situation. The treaties provide that possibility to have emergency measures in cases such as those of Greece. Now we can discuss about, and at SEPS we've published many papers about this, about the effectiveness of relocation without changing EU Dublin system. But the truth is that things are getting more real about the need to ensure better sharing of responsibilities between member states in this issue. The principle of solidarity and fair sharing of responsibilities. Now, we've talked a lot about Schengen, also in the previous presentations, and borders. And here also there is a lot of EU standards on how EU border control should be conducted, how to go about controlling borders. It's the Schengen Borders Code. The European Parliament also played a key role in ensuring better lawmaking in this area. I remember Coelho, MEP Coelho played a very fundamental role in the Schengen governance package, responding to this Franco-Italian controversy that I don't have now time to develop during the Arab Spring. But what it meant effectively was more EU, again, in this area, in terms of evaluating how member states are doing and assessing better when they reintroduce internal border checks. It has been already mentioned, we have a number of member states which still appear to be controlling borders in some parts of their territory, internal border controls. Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, and Norway. Now, how do we interpret this? Of course, the justification was the crisis, the European refugee crisis. On this basis, these member states have been allowed to control their borders since then. And I think we need to be cautious there, and I will call the Commission to more rigorously assess the justifications and the proportionality of these measures. To what extent can we actually measure with, again, evidence that those internal border controls are necessary? And this is a very big question mark. There are even now discussions to amend the Schengen evaluation mechanism precisely to allow member states to have longer periods for internal border checks. But also here, a key development has been the European Border and Coast Guard. I'm sure you've heard about it. I mean, it sounds really ambitious, is the new Frontex. That was one of the, perhaps, most important measures adopted during the crisis climate. A new European Border and Coast Guard, a new Frontex agency with more powers to support member states. Now, I think that the name may be misleading because it sounds really, as something very interesting, but actually when you look at the regulation, and I think it's a welcome development, by the way, this regulation, but it may lead to expectations that cannot be met. Because this new European Border and Coast Guard still depends very much on national member states, highly dependent on member states, what member states, can do or not. And it lacks autonomy. It is not a federal body of European border guards that can be deployed. It's still very much dependent on member states. And last but not least, I have 2 minutes, the Migration Policy Center that I'm representing and CEPS are currently conducting a study on the cost of non-Europe in the field of migration, in the field specifically on legal migration. I don't have the time to go into detail. I can just promise you that early next year we will have it available and published. But if you allow me, also in light of the European refugee crisis, and in perspective of what the Lisbon Treaty says and the better regulation guidelines say on how the EU should legislate and act, I think that foreign affairs, cooperation with third countries in the field of migration, is becoming something we should look more carefully at. We had the EU-Turkey statement, the Western Balkans statement, a number of compacts, deals, declarations, joint way forwards. What are all those things? I'm a lawyer. I look at the treaty. There is nowhere in the treaty that you can actually find an answer. They are extra treaty instruments, extra Lisbon Treaty instruments which have been developed political instruments, which have been developed to cooperate with countries in Africa on expulsion and readmission. And the question is, who is the author? And this is precisely what ended up in the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. Who did the EU-Turkey statement? And then neither the Commission, nor the Council Secretariat, nor the European Council said it wasn't me. So who did it, the court said? Well, perhaps it was the member states, but we don't know precisely. You may need to ask them. Why is this important? I started my presentation about the implications of the Lisbon Treaty in AFSJ and better regulation. And one of the developments of the following the European refugee crisis climate has been actually initiatives which reverse Lisbonization in the areas I've been highlighting. In Schengen, member states were introducing border controls because they saw their powers very much limited. in the 2013 Schengen governance package. In migration, cooperation with third countries using tools which are not legal acts, which make impossible accountability, despite the fact they have huge repercussions on the ground. And the European Parliament has been asking the right questions, I think, to the European Commission, for instance, as regards the implementation of the EU-Turkey deal. Now, untapped potentials, I know I'm over, but just two final ideas. I will hope that despite crises, emergencies, exceptions, that democratic rule of law principles should be always go first. And those principles allow for exceptional measures, but under proper scrutiny, checks and balances. And, you know, the better regulation agenda, I think it has a lot of potential. It should be more systematically implemented by the Commission as well, even in times of crisis. There should be best research and independent evidence to inform policy debates. We also have plenty of evidence already. Plenty of research demonstrating what works, what doesn't work. This should be better utilized, I think. And last point, I think the future really here in AFSJ and the costs of non-Europe brings us to the institutional phases of these areas. And as such, we've proposed that perhaps in the future we will be seeing a European Border and Asylum Service. In both border and asylum law, we have already quite a lot of EU law, actually. So these are two areas where member states' margin of appreciation is very limited. A European Border and Asylum Service, comprising Frontex and EASO, or the new EU Asylum Agency, could address many of the issues, potentially, depending on how they will be done, could address many of the issues on the ground in supporting all member states in doing their job in light of EU law. And last, I think the European Parliament could be more wary about this reverse Lisbonization, reversing Europeanization in areas where we already have a lot of EU. Thank you very much.